Okay, welcome to chapter 3 of this course where we'll be talking about post-production, compositing, and everything else you do when you're done creating your actual 3D scene. So I've been thinking about the best way to convey this information and not make it too simple or too complex at the same time. So I'm breaking this post-production chapter into 3 parts: basic post-production, intermediate, and pro. So in this lesson, we're going to cover the basic post-production and compositing, which is mostly 90% of what you'll be doing in 90% of your videos. This is the framework and the workflow you'll be using. And that involves 4 things. And one is compositing shadows. So you're not just exporting your shadows and just leaving it the way it is. You want to make sure your shadows match the background in terms of intensity, blurriness, sharpness. We are also going to talk about matching the sharpness of your CG objects with the background video. Then we'll talk about color correction, and then we'll talk about sound design. So when you do these 4 things, you have composited the shadows, you make sure it match well. You make sure the sharpness of your footage matches your CG objects, and you do some color correction and you do some sound design. You have created a full packaged video, so it's no longer some animation, it's now a fully produced video. And again, in 90% of the videos you're going to be working with, this is all you need to do. But then there are some times you might have some reflective surfaces in your scene and you want to capture that reflection. That is where we move into the intermediate section of compositing reflections. And there are a lot of ways to do this. There are a lot of workflows to do this. And I'm going to show you the simplest and the most straightforward one. And then finally, when we talk about pro compositing, we're going to talk about the extra stuff you want to add to your scene. If you want to add some smoke effects, fire effects, these are the things you don't use in most videos. You wouldn't have fire effects in 90% of the videos you're working with, in 90% of the ideas you're coming up with. But then I'm still going to show you how to do it just in case you want to add some cracks to the floor or camera shakes, or you want to mask out people or cars or specific things in your scene. All of that I'm going to show it to you in the pro section. But today let's talk about basic compositing in Blender and in Davinci Resolve. You can also do the same thing in After Effects or Premiere Pro or any sort of editing software. So far you understand the principles, you could replicate this in any software. So let's get to it. So this is where we stopped in the last lesson when we talked about rendering, basic rendering, what most people do when they try to render their CG objects or their footage out of Blender. But now we want to render our shadows separately and render our CG objects separately, so we could have extra freedom to fine-tune things in the future. So to do that, we need to create new collections and new view layers. If you did your motion tracking in Blender, remember we deleted a foreground and a background collection here, and Blender automatically adds a foreground and background view layer. So if you come up here to this icon and click on this drop down, you'll see 2 view layers here. Let's go to background and just hit this X to delete it. So there's just 1 view layer now. The reason why I'm deleting it is so I can show you the entire process from the beginning, so you're not just relying on Blender setup, so you understand what is going on behind the scenes. So let's create 2 view layers. For this one, let's call this one sphere, or whatever object we have in the scene. We can call it objects, but let's call it sphere. Then let's click on this, then new, and then let's call this one shadow. So if we click on this drop down, we would have sphere and we would have shadow. So 2 different view layers. And view layers in Blender is basically telling Blender what you want to be looking at. So you could tell Blender, when you're looking through this view layer, this is what you're seeing in the same scene, and when you're looking through this view layer, this is what you're seeing. So that way you could tell Blender, when I want to see only shadows, let me see only shadows and nothing else. When I want to see the CG objects, let me see just that and nothing else. So the next thing we need to do is come to this funnel icon here, and you see there are a lot of toggles here. The ones you're already used to, the hide in viewports, the hide in render toggle. But what we want here is this indirect only toggle. Indirect only, super important. And this pretty much means that when you make an object indirect only, you are telling Blender that you don't want to see that object itself, but the indirect effects of the object. For example, if I have a cube on a floor and I make the cube itself indirect only, I would not see the cube itself, but I will see the shadows that the cube is causing. So let's make sure this is checked. Now we need to create 2 new collections. So right click here and new collection, double click on it, and let's call this sphere. You can call it whatever you want. Let's right click here again and new collection, call this shadow. So make sure these are separate collections. Make sure this one is not underneath this. Make sure it's out here on the same line. So you want them to be lined up like this. So what you want to do is to take every object that is a shadow catcher. So this ground, these cylinders here, and this cube. So ground, cylinders, and cube. Take everything into the shadow collection. Then the main subject of your VFX video, which is this sphere in this case, let's take it to the sphere collection. So we have two collections. I can see we have our indirect only. You can see this toggle here. So when I turn it on, it makes that collection indirect. So let's go into camera view and in rendered view so you can see what I'm saying. So what you want to do now, since we are in the shadow view layer, let's go to the sphere view layer. So you can see nothing changes when I move from shadow to sphere because we have not done anything different. So let's make our first change. In the sphere view layer, you want to click indirect only for the shadow collection. So make sure it's the shadow you are changing it for and click on indirect only. Now you see what happens here. You no longer see the shadow. So in the sphere view layer, Blender can only see the sphere or whatever object you put into that collection. Now let's change this to the shadow view layer. Now this still looks normal. What we want to do here is to click the indirect only for the sphere. So now you can see your render, you are only seeing the shadow. So when we are changing from view layer to view layer, sphere and shadow, you can see we have separated each of them. Now this is what Blender does for you automatically when you try to camera track. It creates a foreground and a background layer and it separates everything for you just like this. Now that we have this, how do we export each of them separately? Let's go to our compositing tab. And this is where we stopped. You know, we talked about merging the movie clip with the render layer, but we're not doing that right now. What we want to do is to render the images of the shadow separately and the images of the sphere separately. So this render layer node, you can see here, it has a drop down, and this drop down is for your view layer. So if I click this drop down, you can see your sphere and your shadow is here. So let's click on the render layers, Shift D to duplicate. Now this one should be the sphere and this one, let's change it to shadow. So when I hit render, this is what Blender is seeing in the shadow view layer. And when I hit render, this is what Blender is seeing in the sphere view layer. So you're seeing just the sphere. Now to render this out, we need a file output node. So instead of coming here and choosing your file name and everything, we can use a file output node. So Shift A and type file output. Now you see this is quite similar to what we have in this output properties here. And to get more of the details of the settings, make sure your file output is selected and come here to node. When you click node, you see all these details you have here is also here. So we are not using this anymore. Let's just forget about this. This is what we're going to use to render. So under input, you can see this image we have here is this image you are seeing here. And also this image will be the file name that you are rendering. What we want to do, the same way we rendered an image sequence for the full render, now we want to render an image sequence for the shadow and also for the sphere. So this one, let's name this sphere. Then let's hit add inputs. You can see it has added a new input here, and let's name this shadow. Now we should connect our render layer image, the one that has the sphere on it, connect it to sphere and connect this image to shadow. So we don't need to touch anything here. So let's click on our file output again. And in the base part, let's go find the folder where we want to render this thing. Remember the last time we did this, we specified the name of the images. We specified it as ball render. So we don't want that now, just delete it. All we want is for Blender to know the folder. Because if I leave it as ball render, Blender is going to create a new folder and put everything in there. That's not what we want. We want it to just go into the render folder. Now, whatever we call this input here is what we're going to see in our file when we render it. So we can call it anything we want. Let's change sphere to FG, foreground, and shadow to BG as background. So you can see it has changed here. Now also check your output properties. Your output properties, you can see is rendering from frame 1 to frame 120. So let's just hit Ctrl F12. Now it's going to start from frame 1, and you see this time is rendering just the sphere alone and it's rendering the shadows alone. So it's going to render each file separately, 120 frames of the shadows and 120 frames of the sphere or whatever CG object you have there. So let's say it's done rendering and we're going to the render folder where we asked Blender to save the files. You will now see that we have the FG file and the BG file. Look, we have BG. So the BG is just a bunch of shadows, frame 1 to frame 120, and the FG is a bunch of spheres from frame 1 to frame 120. So we have two different image sequences that we can use. Now this is how I like to operate. I like to render it out of Blender, then take it into a different software. That software could be Premiere Pro, it could be After Effects, it could be Davinchi Resolve, whatever software that has the capability to make color corrections, to make changes to images or videos. That is what I use. But in this lesson, we're going to use Davinchi Resolve because it is a free software. You can get it for free. So this is Davinchi Resolve, and this is where we stopped in the last lesson. So let's go back to this media tab and go find the folder. This is the render folder where I have everything rendered. You can see BG frame 1 to 120 and FG frame 1 to 120. So let's just take this and this and drag it down. Let me change the in and outs, I here and O here. Now since we have already dropped the background video in here, we already have it in Davinchi Resolve, so we can just take our background, which is the shadow, and drop it here frame 1 to 120. Let's drag this down, then drop our foreground on top of it, and when we play, it's just going to work normally. See, it's basically tracked to the scene. It looks like it's there. But the cool thing now is, unlike the last time when we clearly saw that this shadow is super dark, while this is not that dark and we couldn't change it here. Now we have the freedom to change this. Let's just cut this and drag this here, so we have just 120 frames. Cool. Now let's do something similar to this project. You remember this initial F-Spy project that we did earlier in the course? Let's do something similar so we can render the shadow separately and work with it later. So just for practice, we can change the name of this collection to Object, and then add a new collection, right click new collection, and call this Shadow. So as usual, the only shadow catcher we have here is just this. So take this pen and bring it into shadow, and then yeah, everything else in this empty should be under Object. That's it. Let's take this one out. Cool. So we have everything here under Object, under this empty, and the rest under shadow. Then let's create our view layer. As you can see, we have just one view layer called view layer because we didn't track our camera in Blender, so Blender didn't mess with this. This is by default what it looks like. So let's just call this Object, and then let's add a new one, new, and call this one Shadow. So as we did before, turn on this indirect only, and then in your shadow view layer, make sure your object is indirect only. And then in your object view layer, make sure your shadow is indirect only. So let's see that in the render view to make sure we are doing everything correctly. Now we're in the object view layer, we can see our car and everything, but we can't see the shadows. And if we change this to shadow view layer, we can see our shadow, but we can't see our car. This is exactly what we want. So let me change the render setting to something like 50 samples and 0.5 for the noise threshold. This is like the lowest I go most times. Then under the noise, make sure you use GPU. It's checked if you have a GPU. That would really speed up your renders, and I'm just realizing it. Now we have these two different view layers. Now let's go to the compositing tab, click on use nodes. You can see this is pretty much empty. Then we have this one render layer. Let's shift D to create a new one, change this one to shadow, then add a file output, and then come to node, add your two different file names. So let's call this one Object, and let's add a new input and call this one Shadow, and let's connect the shadow view layer to shadow and the object view layer to object. Cool. Now we also have this one set from 1 to 120. So when I hit render, Ctrl F12, we are going to start rendering. You can see we have rendered this first frame of the car without the shadows. Now we are rendering just the shadows. So it's going to cycle through from frame 1 to frame 120. But thankfully I already rendered all this out so we don't sleep here during the lesson. So back to Davinchi Resolve, back to our media pool, we would see this object and shadow already rendered. So let's take these two and draw them in here. So let's bring the objects up and then the shadow underneath. And we also have to bring in our background video because there's no background video here. So go find your background video and just drop it here. I could delete all of this, just dragging it down here. So yeah, we have the two clips now in our Davinchi Resolve project. We have this one and we have this one. So We basically did the same thing we usually do when we just render everything out, but with extra steps. But what this extra steps does for us is that it gives us a lot of leeway, a lot of freedom to make changes later on. So let's start with the shadows. For this one, we could immediately mess with the shadows by clicking on this background here, this background clip, coming down to opacity and just reducing it or increasing it. And also, if you want it to be darker, you could just duplicate it. You could shift this one up and add a different one, and it's going to be even darker. That is if that's what you want to do. But we want to make it lighter, we want to make it look more like this. So click on your background and reduce the opacity until it kind of matches this one here. I'm just using this as a reference, so let's bring it down. I think it is a lot better here. You can see this is at 65% opacity. Okay, let's bring it down a little bit more. Yeah, you can see this is a lot better than 100, which is so black. You could clearly tell that even though the lighting is accurate, the direction of the light is accurate and all that, this is not meant to be in there because it doesn't match the background. But somewhere around 64 is great. Now you could notice something else about this. It is a little bit sharp compared to this. You can see the edges of this is a little bit, just a tiny little bit blurrier than this. So we can add some form of blur onto our shadow. Something else I noticed is this one has some reddish tints to it. When it comes to shadows, it's not easy to see the tints, but then when you look closely, you realize that this one is more reddish than this. This is more like just black, while this has some form of red tint to it. So we could fix both of those things by going into our Fusion tab. Make sure clips is selected so you can see the clips down here. Now this is the clip that we're interested in, the shadow clip. Now I want to add some blurriness to it, so let's bring this is our blur node. Just click and drag it and drop it in between here. So I'm going to show you how to do all of this in Blender in case you don't want to use Davinci Resolve and just want to stick with Blender. That is cool, but I prefer taking my renders into a software that was designed for things like this. Anyways, now that we have the blur node, you can see here we have the details. You can choose the blur you want. Let's keep it as fast Gaussian, that's the fastest, and let's drag this down. So if we drag this down, you can see we have a very blurry shadow and we can just mess with it. This is a good time to have your reference opened up so you could just make comparisons. So you can see here it is a lot blurrier here by the edge, and let's just make that change here. I'm holding Control to zoom in. So we don't want it to be super blurry like this. Let's just add a little bit of blur to the shadow, like a, yeah, I think a 2.4 is nice. Let's go back to our edit tab. Okay, I think a 2.4 is too much. Let's go back to Fusion and reduce it. Click on this clip, reduce it to like a 1.2. Yeah, let's check that out. Yeah, this is a lot better. This is a lot better. I think the only thing that is left here is to get that red tint. Also, I think I can also mess with the opacity a bit and make it a little bit more transparent. Yeah, that's the freedom you get when you render as multi-layers, as different PNG sequences. You can make these changes. A very new beginner will just render straight from Blender as a video. You are losing a lot of freedom. So let's add the tint, the tiny red tints. Go to our color tab, where we do color grading, and this might look overwhelming if you have never done any color grading before, but yeah, I'm just going to show you the easy steps. Let's come here to the color wheels. There are a lot of options here. Davinci Resolve is a professional software for color correction, color grading, all that stuff, but you could use curves to make adjustments to different parts of your scene, and you could use the color wheels. So color wheels is what I'm going to use to add this red tint. So come here, make sure you're clicking on this. This is the shadow clip. You can see if I bring this down and up, we can adjust how bright and how dark we want it to be. Yeah, instead of using the opacity, you can also use this. You could use this to fine tune and get how dark or how bright your shadows should be. So let's undo that and let's add a little bit of tint. If we move this lift under the lift, if we move this towards the red, you can see we're making it very red. And also for the offsets, we are also affecting it. So you just want to affect it just a little bit. So just be very careful and just drag it here just a tiny little bit. So you can see a little bit of warmness coming into it. Yeah. Let's also mess with the offsets just a tiny little bit, just to get in that warmth in there. Yeah, we don't need to do too much, just to make sure it's not just dark, but it has that warmth to it. So yeah, we have basically composited the shadow. We have made it look a lot closer to this. Remember, it was in the beginning, it was too sharp and it was too dark. So we have made it match a lot more. Now let's make the entire scene match better. If we zoom in, you can see that our CG object is sharper than the background. This happens all the time. When you're rendering from a computer program, a 3D software, you're mostly rendering super sharp images because it's a computer. It makes it very, very sharp, very, very clear, very accurate. There is little distortion. So you have to match that when you are compositing. You can see, if I look at this, you can see how blurry this side is. You can see how blurry every side of the clip is. But when I look at my sphere, it's looking a lot sharper. Not a lot, but a tiny bit sharper. So let's click on this sphere, go into Fusion tab, and also bring a blur node here and drop it. But we don't want this one to be too blurry like the last one. We don't want 1. We want something a lot lower. I usually use 0.4. Most of the time 0.4 works for me. It's just a little bit of blur. So you could just look and compare. You can see now our sphere is matching a lot better. So these are the tiny little things that make your videos pop. That is the extra step to make it look better. And funny enough, depending on you, it all depends on you how much detail you want to put, how much work you want to put in your video. When I did my 30-day challenge, I didn't do any major compositing for any of the videos because the point of that challenge was to get out a VFX video every day. It wasn't to create the most marvelous video. So I had to like speed up the process and just do color correction. But if I'm working on an actual project, I make sure I go through all of this and make sure the shadows match. So now we have matched the blurriness, we have matched the shadows. What else can we do? Let's do some color correction. Now this is up to you. Let's come back to the color tab. Depending on how you want your video to look, you could mess with color correction. Now there are a lot of ways to do this. If I click on the background footage here, this guy, I could increase the saturation. You can see the sky is a lot bluer now. I could mess with the shadows, which is the dark portions. I can make it brighter, can make the dark portions darker. You could color correct. So what I usually do, if I'm not messing with the RGB curves, because this is one way to mess with the look of your image. If I increase this and I bring this down to draw like an S curve, we have more contrast in the image, it's a lot sharper. But you can also go back to your color wheels tab and do everything here. So let's say I increase the saturation so we have very vibrant skies, and then I increase the contrast a little bit so it's a background video that I prefer. You can also mess with the RGB curves just a tiny little bit so it's a more high contrast image. Now the trick here is you have to match your CG objects to the background. Now the background is more vibrant, is more sharp, is more high contrast. You have to click on your clip, your sphere clip, and do the same thing. Increase this, make it a bit sharper. Come here to saturation, increase it a little bit. Yeah, now it looks like it's part of the clip. If the saturation for your CG object is too much, you can see it does not match. This is weird. If it's too low, it doesn't match. It's very weird. Everything is colorful while it's not. So just make sure they line up. Also, make sure the brightest point of your image matches the brightest point here. So you can see here is the brightest point of my CG image where it's reflecting the sun. And for the background, where's the brightest point here? So you just make sure this matches. And you can mess with that using your highlights. You can increase your highlights and make this brighter. You can reduce your highlights to make the brightest part darker. You could also make these changes in your RGB curves. So the thing with color grading is it's an entire topic, it's an entire course on its own. But you don't need to understand every single tool in Davinci Resolve. Most of these things here, I don't even use them most of the time. Most times I'm messing with the RGB curves, or I'm messing with these color wheels and these details here. So your shadows will make your darker areas brighter. You can make these areas around it to be a little bit brighter. and just do more color matching. So you are correcting the colors. So this is a lot better than where we were before. Let's just do a quick comparison. Let me drop this here and drop this here. And look, this is where it was before. It was just too dark. It wasn't matching, too sharp. But now we have something that works a lot better. This looks like it's meant to be there in the shot. So this is what we are trying to achieve. So we are basically done basic compositing for our image to make it match a lot better. And the final thing will be sound design. I don't think we need any sound design here because nothing is happening, but we can do sound design for this guy here because we have a car driving in. Yeah, so sound design just elevates your renders, your work. If you don't do sound design, it could be alright. People might appreciate just the visuals of it, but sound design brings it together. It's that extra step that really, adds the extra 99.999% to your work. But here, I think the only sound effects we need here is the environment ambient sound effect. So that's the first thing I think about. Where is this environment? Are people walking around? And the way I recorded this video, I already had audio in it, so I could just use the default sound effect, the environment ambient sound effect that comes with the video. So if you don't have that, you could go and download street ambient sound effects. These are things you could search for, street ambience, depending on the scene. If it's in a supermarket, for example, you find some supermarket ambient sound effects, but then we'll do all that when we are talking about this guy here. Now let me show you how to do these things in Blender. If I go into Blender, you can see our viewer is showing just this. Our viewer is showing just this guy here. If you are compositing in Blender, then you don't need this file output node, because this file output node is if you are taking everything out of Blender to do outside Blender. But if you're doing your compositing inside of Blender, let's just delete this file output node and then keep our viewer, keep our composite. Now we have our image here, our movie clip. Now if this is not here, just Shift A, add movie clip, and then go find your movie clip. Just click on this folder and find your movie clip on your PC. And the same way we did in the last lesson to use the alpha rover node to add this guy, the render layer on top of this, we are going to do something similar. So let's Control Shift click the alpha rover. So we are viewing this. So Control Shift click to view just the background, just this, just the shadows, and this. Yeah. Now let's just hit F12 to render just one frame so I can show you an example of how you can composite this thing also in Blender. Cool. Now we have rendered one frame. Now we can see our shadow here separately. We can see this here separately. Now this is the best way to do it, the professional way to composite shadows here. When you look at this, you think you just need another alpha rover node. In fact, that is how I used to do it way back. Just add another alpha rover node and put this on top of it. But actually the best way to do this is to use the alpha output of this shadow and using the alpha outputs to mess with your movie clip. Let me show you what I mean. So first thing to do is to add a color balance node. So Shift A and start typing color balance. Yeah, here it is. Now you can see this looks familiar. It looks very similar to what we had here. You remember our lift, gamma, gain, offset. We have the same thing here, lift, gamma, gain, and we have offset, power, slope here. So we have all these color wheels here. If you need your contrast, you can add a contrast brightness contrast node. So you could mess with brightness and contrast. You can add a saturation. So all these things that we have already in Davinci Resolve, they are individual nodes here in Blender, so you can add all these nodes. So let me undo all of that. We only need our color balance right now. So let's add the color balance on top of the movie clip, just between the movie clip and the alpha rover. Now with this, if I mess with this, if I make this blue, it's going to affect the entire background. So it's messing with the background itself. If I'm reducing the brightness, it's messing with the entire background. That's not what we want. We want it to mess with just the alpha image of this shadow. So let me undo all of that. Cool. Now let's connect the alpha to the factor. Now what this does is when I make changes here, it's no longer affecting the whole of this image. It's affecting just this portion, this cutouts, this alpha that is created by the shadow on top of the image. So if I bring this down and I bring this down, I bring this down, you can see we're already bringing our shadow in. And this way we could just start from the top. We could mess with this. If we bring everything down, we have a very dark shadow. If we increase it a bit and try to match it here, you can just immediately try to match it here without messing with the lift So I think this is good. So this is the better way to do it inside of Blender. And we can also add the tint, you know, the red tint that we did. So you can mess with the gain, the gamma, the lift to add more detail. If I bring this lift down towards the red, you can see we're making it a little bit more red. So you can mess with this. You can make it very blue, very green, but then want just a little bit of some red orangeness to it. Yeah, you're just trying to make it match this background image. Let's reduce that a bit. Bring this here. Yeah, I think this is good. So to add the blurriness the same way we did in Davinchi Resolve, we could hit Shift A and get a blur node. So everything in Blender is node. It is all nodes since we are compositing using a node structure. So we will add it here just right after our shadow. Add a blur. This is already Gaussian. You could mess with the X and the Y. So you can just click and drag down, and let's make this 20. You can see it's a lot blurrier now. You can see right here. Let's undo that. You don't want it to be 20. You want it to be something like yeah, I think 6 or 5 is good. Yeah, just a little bit blurriness at the edge, just to match this. What else do we want? I don't think it should be this. Let's make it a little bit lighter. So let's bring this up a tiny bit. Yeah, so I think we have done some good compositing here. And also, yeah, to mess with the blurriness of this guy here, we could just Shift D and duplicate this guy and drop it in front of here. So we could also mess with the blurriness of this render, this sphere. We could make it like 30, just as an example. You can see now our sphere itself is super blurry. So let's keep it at I think 5 is too much. This is not the shadow. Let's bring it down a little bit to about 1 or 2. So the values depend on the software you're using. I think 2 is alright. So I think 1. Now let's make it a 2. Yeah, I think 2 is alright. It matches a lot better. Now we have done everything that we did in Davinchi Resolve by moving our sliders up and down. We have done it now with using nodes. And this is, when you see this without the explanation, it looks like a super complex setup. It's nothing complex. We just have our shadows here, going to our blur to add some blur. We have our sphere going to the blur to add some blur. We have our color balance to mess with the details of the shadow to match the tint of your background video. And then we connect that with an alpha rover. Now when we render this, we don't need to add a file output for this. Just make sure the composite, this guy here, is connected to your alpha rover. Yeah, so whatever you are viewing is what you are compositing. Now if we render this, if I hit F12, it's going to render everything combined. So if you don't want to use Davinchi Resolve, you don't want to use After Effects, Premiere Pro, you can do everything in Blender. It's just, you know, it's not a straightforward process. If I want to do sound design, I have to render it, then find a video editing workflow in Blender. That's just stress. I already use Davinchi Resolve for editing, so I'll just rather do my color grading and all that there. So yeah, that is how you do very quick, very simple, straightforward compositing inside of Blender. And it's the same process for any editing software. Just make sure you find your color wheels, make sure you find your RGB curves, your different settings in that software. So let's do the same thing for this guy here. What would we want to change here? Let me open up this background video just as a reference. You can see here, we're going to use this as a reference. That is why you need reference. If I didn't keep this recording going as long as I did to get this car in the scene as a reference, we wouldn't have this as a reference. We would have just been winging it. That is not advisable. So using that as reference, we want to match the shadows. We want to match everything in the scene. So first of all, let's just go to our Fusion and make sure we have this top clip selected, this one, and add the blur. This is like the thing you should always do. Just add the 0.4. So you have a little bit of blurriness on top of your CG image. Now in our reference, you can see that there is some sort of blue tint, some bluish, greenish tint on our shadow. So in here, let's do that. Let's go to our color correction, go to the shadows, and add a little bit of some bluish, greenish tints. Let's use the lift. Let's just drag the lift a little bit so we can see, yeah, this is a lot more like this. Okay, maybe that's a little bit too much. Let's bring it back. Now we have that tiny touch of blue, matching this a lot better. Now I think this is slightly blurrier in the edges. You can see the fall off is way over here, slightly blurrier than this. So let's go back to our Fusion tab and make sure you have the shadow selected. Let's add a blur. Yeah, we don't want to do a lot here. Let's bring it to 0. We just want a little bit of blurriness here. So let's say like a 12. Let's see what a 12 looks like. Yeah, let's come back here. No, this is too much blurriness. Let's go back here. Boom. Oh, I set it to 112. Let's change it to a 12. Yeah, I think a 12 is perfect. Yeah. Now this looks more like this. You can see it looks a lot more similar. And then you can do the same thing with the overall color correction. You can see the highlight on this sky is not as bright. The highlight here is not as bright. This is a lot brighter. So in our color tab, we could mess with that too. We could come to highlight and increase it a bit. Make adjustments accordingly. If we want the background to pop a little bit more, we can also increase the saturation of the background. You can see it is now a lot more colorful. And increase the contrast a bit. And now that would change the situation anyway. Since we have done that, now we have to increase the saturation of the foreground just a tiny little bit and increase the contrast a tiny little bit. So it should match a lot better. So this is you just looking at all these signs and trying to match these different parameters, these different things in your scene. I think this matches a lot better, especially the shadows. You can see the blue tint. You can see the blue tint that is meant to be there, that wasn't there before. These are little things that a lot of people might not consider, a lot of people might not notice, but then you're an artist, so you need to put in consideration when you're working on a real project to try as much as possible to match your shadows, your colors and all that to your reference, your background video. Now the last thing would be sound effects. So if I play this, we have sound effects of the environment. And in this case, since I already had a car passing by, so let's just drag this footage. Let's drag this to all the way down. Since I already had a car passing by, I can just use the same exact sound effects here. So I can just cut this and bring this over here. So we have these exact sound effects here. But what I do most of the time is to find sound effects from Envato Elements. I've been using this website for like 4 years now, and yeah, this is where I find my sound effects. They have a lot of other things here apart from sound effects, like music, stock videos. I find everything here. So let's say we want to find something with a car passing by, we'd see a lot of things here. But yeah, we have a lot of sound effects here that we could now download and take into Davinci Resolve. Another place to find sound effects would be on YouTube. You can go on YouTube and search for car passing sound effects. You're going to see a lot of them here, which you can use in your videos. And the last place to find sound effects would be on your audio library if you have a YouTube channel. And anyone can have a YouTube channel with just one click. Go on YouTube, create a channel. It gives you access to all this royalty-free music and royalty-free sound effects. So let's see if we can find a car passing sound effects here. Yeah, that's the thing with this. It's not super exhaustive. We have a truck driving, but we can't find exactly what we are looking for. And when it comes to sound effects, there are a lot of searching that is involved. So yeah, that's basically all that I do when I'm compositing 99% of the videos I'm working with. I just mess with the shadows to make sure it matches. I mess with the colors to make sure the background saturation, the contrast, the highlights and the shadows match, and pretty much that, yeah. So if I want to increase the highlights or shadows of this background, I need to make sure I do the same thing to my CG object. So that's just pretty much it. Making your renders pop, the extra 10%, the extra 1% to your video that makes it a lot more integrated with your background videos. And there are a lot of ways to do this. You could use Premiere Pro or After Effects and use the allumetry color to fine tune your settings. So whatever tools you have in your disposal, if you have just Blender, you don't want to mess with any of that tool, you can do just that. So this is basically my entire workflow when it comes to working with 99% of videos. So in cases where you have reflections, you have mirrors, you have reflective surfaces, reflective floors, or you have a car or a glass in the scene, it's not such a straightforward process. There's a lot of things you have to do in between your rendering and your editing, so you could make sure you capture just the reflection. It's the same thing we are doing where we rendered passes. We rendered the shadow pass and we rendered just the color pass to create our final beauty pass. But then when you're rendering reflection, you have to also think about the glossy pass and all of that and find a way to composite it properly. So we'll get into that in the next lesson.